Okay, so I want to welcome everybody. As I said earlier, if you have any questions, send them by text. I'll see them, or you can text them at the end when we're done. So I want to thank everybody for being here. I've had already hundreds of questions that have come to me since we sent out a video about these issues on earlier in the week. So this was updated based on those conversations, and I hope that you find it useful. So welcome. A little bit about my background is I've been doing this for about 35 years. I've written books. As a matter of fact, I have an interview scheduled with CTV News later this afternoon to deal with some of the issues that we're going to be talking about today. I've written columns in the Toronto Star and Real Estate Magazine, and I'm a senior partner with realestateLawyers.ca LLP. These are the books that are always available in case anybody wants to find them. And I want to explain first how our law firm is probably leading the way in getting ready for practicing and closing real estate deals during these times. We are putting together technology so we can sign clients up from anywhere. At present, we go to the client's home and sign them up on an iPad virtually everywhere all over Ontario, but we're trying to comply with recent Law Society guidelines, which will allow us to sign even without seeing the client in person, but going through a lot of steps to make sure that we are properly verifying their identity. So we are practicing distance, keeping a safe distance in everything we do. And this permits us to close real estate deals everywhere. And frankly, the time for sending real estate commissions by check is over. And all those firms that continue to do that have to step up. We today pay all agents by EFT, and that's how we pay all sellers as well. When it comes to our buyers, they don't even have to go to the bank, and that could be an issue going forward. They're able to pay us directly into our own trust account with a bill payment the same way they're paying a Bell bill from their home computer. And this way, we can also assist brokerages who are not equipped for an e-transfer or wire transfer, that we can hold deposits under real estate agreements directly for the buyer and seller. So I've seen some notes that the sound is not good. I'm trying to speak a little bit louder, and I hope it is working better. We also are dealing with key deliveries the way we always have. We're putting lock boxes on the seller homes and lobbying for every law firm to do this so that keys do not have to be exchanged on the day of closing. We're trying to eliminate any kind of delivery, courier, or anything else from a real estate transaction, so it can all be done remotely. And I'm available for legal support and advice. The easiest way is to email me, mark@realestateLawyers.ca. Okay, first question. Can a buyer cancel a deal due to COVID-19? Now, I'm getting some questions that you can't hear me that well. Let me see if I can improve that. Hold on. I'm going to try to improve the internet. Okay, now this should, I think I've improved my internet connection. let's just see, can people hear me a little bit better now? Yes, okay, terrific. So thank you, everyone. And we should be good to go. Thank you. So the first question, can a buyer cancel a deal due to COVID-19? And the answer is no. I've received many requests from buyers already that they cannot close a deal right now due to issues arising from the COVID-19 virus. Unfortunately, this is very similar to the mini market crash in 2017. And so remember, you cannot cancel because of this. The only way a deal could be canceled is if the government registration system completely closed down, or if lenders could not fund any mortgage loans, and none of this has happened yet. And so what we're doing today, as we always try to do, we're trying to fairly extend deals on terms that are good for both the buyer and the seller to try and get a transaction closed to avoid any legal proceedings. And that's the way you have to look at this. You have a role to play too, to try to help us negotiate any extension. What happens when buyers cannot close? Well, the deposit stays in the listing brokerage trust account until a mutual release is signed. Now, the seller can resell and sue for the difference in price. Now, it happens that if the seller was able to sell for more, they could still sue for the deposit, which is not likely during these times. But as a listing brokerage, you cannot relist until you receive something from the seller lawyer confirming that the buyer is in breach and that the seller is going to put the house back on the market and then go after the buyer for any damages. But when it comes to making that decision, do you sue? No situation is the same. You know, if some buyers are first-time buyers, very small down payment, mortgage, CMHC insured, well, they don't have money for you to sue or collect. And so these are decisions you have to make smart so that you make the right decision, whether to settle, take the deposit, split the deposit, or move on and try and get the deal done some way else through an extension. So are you entitled to commission? Well, if a buyer cannot close, the listing brokerage cannot sue the seller for any commission. Now, a buyer brokerage could sue a buyer if there was a signed BRA. Now, if a seller refused to close, then the listing brokerage could sue for commission. And so if the buyer and seller sign a mutual release, the brokerage could only sue for commission if they have not signed the mutual release. So I always recommend that you do sign the mutual release, but if you do not want to, you still have to follow the instructions of the buyer and the seller regarding the deposit. And you know, in these times, if a buyer can't close because of market conditions, I think a brokerage has to think very carefully before starting any lawsuit, because social media would not look kindly on that type of case. So as a result of deposits perhaps being locked up in a trust account, this clause has been developed so that if a condition is not waived for any reason by a buyer, the money always goes back. So I'm going to show you the clause, and you have all this information in the handout that was sent to you that you could look at before and after during this webinar. So if you look at the clause, it says that if the buyer does not waive the conditions within the times, then the seller and the buyer give the listing brokerage an irrevocable direction to release the deposit directly to the buyer without the necessity of a mutual release. So even if the seller suspects the buyer is not acting in good faith or because of the market conditions, they would have to return the deposit. So RICO has already looked at this clause and said it's fine. However, they recommend that you discuss this with the seller so the seller understands that this is the right of the buyer if this clause is inserted. The question about settling or suing. I always believe in settling because the costs to pay lawyers are just too much money. And in my experience, when times start to go bad, the current deal is usually the best deal the seller is going to get. And so try to save the deal. And one is an extension and perhaps getting a further deposit in exchange for the extension, vendor take-back mortgage to assist the buyer, or sometimes even a reduction in the purchase price if that is the best you can negotiate. Sometimes we even decide to put the house back on the market just to see how much money the seller can get from a new buyer so they can better calculate whether they're going to lose any money before signing any release. So there are ways you can help. Do your best to try to save any deal. One of the biggest problems with real estate closings is when people buy and sell on the same day, because besides being incredibly stressful, if your sale does not close for any reason, then you are on a truck on the way to the home you purchased and you can't close because you don't have the money from your sale. Your furniture is on a truck. You may have to store it, go to a hotel, and it's a nightmare when that happens. So wherever possible, buy first and see if you can obtain bridge financing, even for a day or two. Then if the sale needs an extension, it's just an interest cost which the buyer can pay in order to compensate the seller. Then somebody is not on a truck in the middle of nowhere with nowhere to go. And so please try wherever possible. Now, I realize it's not always the case. If you have seniors who are downsizing and they're not getting a mortgage, it will be very hard for them to get bridge financing. And in those cases, when we have to close both deals, we can do them. And I know at our firm, because we do everything by wire, we're able to set this up so that, frankly, even if we get funds from a buyer lawyer at 5:45 p.m., we're still able to wire it into the seller lawyer's trust account before 6. And as long as you get the money into the seller lawyer trust account before 6, you can close the deal in escrow. I said earlier that our firm could accept deposits under agreements of purchase and sale. This is our instructions that we give. If any of you require this, whether it's for a buyer that you're working with where the listing brokerage does not accept or cannot accept deposits by wire, please get in touch with us and we can offer this as a solution to help deals get entered into, at least, correctly and timely. So now I want to turn to clauses to consider. Now, as you know, these clauses have been floating around now for the last week or so. What should we do with agreements that we're entering into so that we make sure they close? And so these are clauses that I've given out. I've seen others, and I'm going to comment on all of them right now. So the first one is a clause that looks the same, but instead of bank drafts or certified checks, it's only wire transfer. We want to eliminate any certified check or bank draft from being delivered by anyone to anyone. Who knows if couriers are going to be working? And so everything has to be done by wire. And as well, the second clause deals with electronic commerce. And so you do this already. You sign everybody on DocuSign. This will allow lawyers to do the same thing, and more importantly, exchange everything by email. Unfortunately, we can't exchange keys by email, and that's why we developed our own lockbox solution a few years ago, where we just give our sellers a lockbox. They leave it on the door, and we will give the code to the lockbox to the buyer lawyer only when we receive the money into our trust account. And we've been asking other firms to do this, and now we're hoping that everyone just does this to make the key exchange process as simple as possible. Here is a clause that is attempting to deal with what happens if the registry system closes down and there's no way to close the deal, or financial institutions close down because something's wrong with their own online ability to transfer funds. So it's unlikely this is going to happen. The people who run the government registration system are all working remotely. They're not in an office, and they're keeping the system up. But what this does say is, okay, if this happens, we'll extend 5 business days after the systems come up, and then we're able to close the deal. Here's an alternate clause. Now, this clause will take effect, again, if something happens and the land registration system goes down. However, it permits us to close the deal if title insurance cooperates. So let me explain so you understand this. Today, before we have this crisis, let's say we have a deal that's closing Friday, and the buyers are ready to move in, but the buyer money doesn't get to the seller lawyer trust account until 5:30. Okay, the registry system has closed. It closes at 5 o'clock, but we can still close in escrow. And what that means is that the buyer can have the keys and they can move in, and the seller is entitled to the money. And we register first thing Monday morning when the system opens up. Now, people ask me, well, what happens if somebody registers a lien on title Monday morning at 9 o'clock before you register? Well, title insurance provides something called gap coverage, so that all of this goes away because of title insurance. So you see, even if the registry system goes down, there will likely be a way to work with title insurance to make sure that we are able to close the deal, even in these conditions. So we're going to try and do everything we can to close a deal. Now, there have been other clauses where people are saying that if someone gets sick with the COVID-19 virus, then the deal will be extended 14 days. But it's very hard to verify why someone is requesting this. Is there a government order? Is it because they're self-isolating? Do they need something from a hospital? And so I'm not happy, frankly, with any of these types of clauses. I know already we are dealing with buyers who are asking for extensions because of the virus, and sellers are working with them to make it happen. And my feeling is that that is what we need to be doing should that occur. And it's just too hard to try to contemplate every one of those events in advance. So I caution against them. And as well, I saw one clause saying that if the property market value falls 10% before closing, the buyer can cancel the deal. Again, you cannot accept those kinds of clauses. It'll be impossible to prove, And so try to limit what you're putting into an agreement. I always believe try to keep the closing dates relatively close, no more than 60 days, and we'll get through this and get our deals closed. I've been asked the question about what happens, especially during these times, if agreements are not signed correctly. So it's very possible with everybody running around or doing things remotely with remote signatures and DocuSign that an agreement could be accepted after the irrevocable time, or a condition may be waived after the date in the agreement. And if you're late, even by 10 minutes, the agreement is terminated. So people say, well, let's say that happened, but the people want to put the deal back together again. And we don't really want to sign a mutual release because then you got to wait for the money to come back and it's got to clear and you got to wait 2 weeks and start again. And by then you're finished. So what I've done is I've created an amendment that you can use. You just have to fill in the blanks. And what this will do will allow you to put the deal back together again. So it's in the first bullet, you describe the date of the agreement. Then you say the parties have agreed to novate, to create again and revive the purchase agreement. And then it says the purchase agreement is hereby restated and novated on the same terms, subject to the following. So that now you make it clear the deposits are credited to the purchase price so that you don't have to do a release for the deposits. Any condition is now deemed to have been fulfilled or waived, so you deal with any issue. The new closing date shall be, and all other terms continue, and time continues to be of the essence. So this is a clause you can use, and based on the reaction I've had, people find this very helpful to keep in their toolkit. Now we'll go to some clauses that I've recommended, and I think they're more important than ever now because showings may be limited because of the virus. People may be relying on video tours instead of showings. They may reduce showings to 15 minutes, 20 minutes. And so because of this, it's very important that you list everything in the chattels and fixture clause so that nothing is forgotten later. Key clause, condominiums. After closing, I constantly get these complaints from buyers about not receiving 2 full sets of keys. And so here's a clause that deals with every possible key that they need, and hopefully there is a lockbox clause that can be dealt with later. Now with condominiums, I appreciate that sometimes lockboxes cannot be left in a convenient place, and we're encouraging buyers and sellers to work together in those cases, perhaps with the concierge, to arrange a key delivery right at closing. I've also got a key clause for homes that you can use so that every interior door, garage door, openers, everything is delivered and left either in the house or in the lockbox on closing. Rental agreements. Very important here that you put this clause in. The agreement of purchase and sale may say that the buyer agrees to assume a rental, but in some cases, if they don't sign the contract with the rental company, the rental company still goes after the seller after closing. And so it's very important that you put this clause in and you get it signed so that this obligates the buyer to sign all this before closing. A question came in about a deposit check. So let's say an offer is signed today, and as you know, the deposit is due in 24 hours. and it's not paid. And if it's not paid, that's the same as a breach. And the seller could sue the buyer for breaching the contract. It's very similar to just not closing. And so it's not an answer that you sign an agreement and then just say, I changed my mind because I'm not paying the deposit. It's the same result. The seller could still put the property back on the market and sue for any deficiency if they sell the property for less money. Holdbacks. This is a clause that I developed primarily so that if a buyer did a home inspection and it came back and there was work to be done, and now we had to do an amendment where the seller is doing work, I developed this clause so that money could be held back until the seller provided the buyer either some kind of a letter from a licensed electrician, plumber, or contractor, as the case may be, that the work was done. And if they didn't give that letter or certificate, then the money comes out of the holdback. And so that's how I developed this clause. Now the question becomes, when buyers have a very limited amount of time to view a house, should money be held back on closing so the buyer can go in and check and look for issues? And I just can't see any seller accepting that. So what I would recommend is, if you cannot do a full visit showing because the seller doesn't want a lot of people there, then you make a inspection condition take place after the agreement is signed. And if the buyer is not happy with the condition of the home after he really gets in to look at it, he can cancel the deal. That is really the only, I think, proper way to deal with this. Anytime you get to these holdback clauses, you will never be able to satisfy a buyer or a seller. Now we come to residential tenancies. And a question was raised on this, so I'm going to deal with it as I go ahead. So let's say your tenant's lease is over and they're month to month, and you want to sell the property. Can you evict the tenant? The answer is no. Legally, the only way you can evict is if you find a buyer who buys the property and agrees to move into the property on closing. That's the only legal way to evict. And so when I'm speaking to landlords, especially in this climate, I'm trying to get them to make a deal with the tenant. See if you can find the tenant another place to live. First, pay them compensation, move them out before you list, and then it'll be much easier for you to sell. Someone asked me and said, they gave the proper notice and the tenant is supposed to leave March 31st, and the closing is scheduled for April 15th. Well, what happens if the tenant doesn't leave? Well, number one, the landlord and tenant board is closed. So you're not going to be able to get any order. And as a result, effectively, if the tenant just wants to stay there, the deal is not going to close. So rather than wait to the last minute, I would recommend to this person who asked the question is that go meet with the tenant now, find out, do they have a place to go? And if it means the landlord even paying an incentive to get them to move, that is still a better solution for your problem, because practically speaking, you will not be able to arrange the eviction. So if you have a buyer today and you have a tenant and you don't have an agreement to leave, there are three possible buyers for the unit. Number one, the buyer can accept the tenant. That is probably your best buyer because you don't have to uproot the tenant. They accept the tenant. let's say the buyer wants vacant possession because they want to fix the unit up and double the rent. Well, right away, that's an issue, but it's a possible buyer. And the third is, as the question raised, the buyer legitimately, in good faith, wants to move in on closing. So those are your three potential buyers. So if it's the first buyer, that's the best buyer. You just say in the agreement that the buyer accepts the tenant, you transfer the rent, and you're away to the races. Now, if the buyer wants vacant possession, legally it's not permitted. You could still do this if you made the deal conditional on making a deal with the tenant. So let's say the buyer offered you $20,000 above asking, and it wasn't a bidding war, but they did this because they knew they could increase the value by raising the rent. So now the seller can make the deal conditional on making a deal with the tenant. And if you can make that deal with the tenant, well, then you can close. If you can't make the deal with the tenant, well, then you're not going to be able to close. If the buyer is going to move in, this is the clause that comes from my own landlord guide, and it's the clause that we recommend that people have been using for years, that the proper 60-day notice will be given to the tenant, and if they raise any fuss, well, normally you could go to the landlord and tenant board to arrange the eviction. That's not the case now. And this is why I say to people that if you're trying to sell a home today with a tenant, it's much better to meet with the tenant first and see how successful you are going to be with sort of making some kind of deal, and then do that first instead of relying on these clauses, because I have seen, even without the virus situation, I have seen some tenants delay closing for up to a year by fighting an eviction. Other questions about landlords and tenants, since I'm on the subject. I have received hundreds of emails from landlords and tenants not knowing what to do. The tenants can't pay the rent. The government is likely going to not permit people to be evicted. As I said earlier, if the landlord and tenant board is closed, there really isn't a way for a residential tenant to be evicted. And so what I'm recommending is that they have to work with the tenants to collect as much rent as they can, and to defer rent for a bit later. Don't forgive rent, but defer rent, because at the same time, many lenders are also working with landlords to permit them to add their interest payments to the principal for a few months until this situation calms down. And you know, I realize that if a tenant doesn't pay rent for 4 or 5 months, and then all of a sudden has to pay 5 months rent, they may not be able to do that. And this is why I expect the government is going to get involved to figure out how to protect both tenants and landlords in these situations. And this is why I'm recommending that people still work together to get it done. And as to whether a landlord has an obligation to disclose to a tenant about delinquent rent. So let's say you're selling an income property and it's supposed to close in the middle of April, and now half the tenants have said they're not paying April rent. Should this be disclosed to a buyer? In my belief, it would have to be disclosed. Usually there are clauses where, you know, the leases are in full force and effect, et cetera, and that all the rents have been paid. And so I'm not a big fan of trying to deceive a buyer about this, because the fact is the buyers are going to be asking about this, because this is happening everywhere. And again, people should always act in good faith and try and figure this out. Showings. So I appreciate that AREA just issued a communication today that they don't want in-person meetings. FaceTime video tours are recommended, but still some people will do showings. And I think you have to practice safe. We all know what to do. You know, it could be masks, gloves, warnings to people that if you have any symptoms, don't enter the home under any circumstances. So the same practices that we're all seeing everywhere from the government: stay home, don't go out if you have a symptom, if you've come from anywhere in the last 14 days, self-isolate. You know, people have to do the same thing when it comes to real estate. And I've been asked this question a lot about, well, should we get a waiver of liability from anyone entering the home? In other words, I think that some brokerages, some head offices have already put together a form where the buyers are saying anybody who comes in the house is not going to make a claim against anyone if they get sick. But I frankly don't even know if that's necessary. Real estate has been deemed an essential service, so people should know that they should go and try and protect themselves the way they do when they go to the grocery store. And so while I'm not against these clauses, I'm not sure they change the law materially. I think everybody just has to do what's comfortable for them and be safe in everything they do. Open houses, I'm not sure anyone is conducting open houses, but if you are and you have the same kinds of rules that just 2 people in at a time with the same symptom warning and everything else, you know, again, it's just practicing safe return to business. ID verification. And so this brings us to FINTRAC. And as you know, FINTRAC wants you to identify somebody in person. And this is a challenge now with, we don't want to be in person with people. And so you want to limit the time. So if you're going to do it, you may want to have a mask, gloves, just take a picture of the person's picture ID, and that's all. Do everything afterwards. Do everything in your office, ask to get it by, fill it in later. So you limit the time with somebody. Or there will be ways to do this, I think, very shortly in a video chat where the client shows you their ID, and you may want to record the video where the client is there showing you the front and back of their ID, and then immediately they take a picture and send it to you. So you have a timestamp essentially at the same time you're talking to them, recording them, they send you the picture. And to me, if you do all this and you keep a record of it, it's going to be very hard for the FINTRAC authorities to say you should have been doing something else. Now, I believe for the Barrie board, many of you may use the FINTRAC application, where you just have to click your phone on somebody's ID and it fills out the form. That you still would have to meet the person to take that photo. I believe that the app owners are trying to develop a solution that is similar to what I'm saying, that you could do this somehow through a video chat. But to me, that's the solution. You want to try to keep a record, including recording the call. When you do the identification, you could do the recording on an iPhone and then just send it in and keep the file with the file to satisfy any FINTRAC auditor. Disclosure. I think that it is important to go over the rules of disclosure because people will not be able to properly inspect a home. And does this change the rules of disclosure? Well, until the government makes some changes, I don't think so. So it's still going to be up to buyers to figure out ways to do home inspections as best they can. Home inspectors, movers, stagers, as far as I'm concerned, they are all part of the essential service real estate. I get these questions all the time. Videographers, they're all working in this real estate essential service, and so they can attend, as far as I'm concerned. So a patent defect does not have to be disclosed. That means that if there's a broken window, crack on the kitchen counter, this does not have to be disclosed by a seller, but it's a bit of a challenge if the buyer doesn't have a chance to see the home so they can lift up the toaster oven to see what's underneath. So this is going to be a challenge, and that's why you've got to still try to arrange to see the house and have it inspected if possible. You know, people, if they want to list it, they still should be permitting people to see it, whether it's before they sign the offer or after it's accepted, even if it's subject to a condition. So under the law, if it's a major hidden defect that a home inspector couldn't see, that makes the house unlivable, and the seller knew about it, that has to be disclosed. So examples are foundation problems, major leaks, mold behind the walls. Even if you had the home inspected, a home inspector would likely not be able to see these things. So the law is that it has to be disclosed to any buyer. What I did not mention is psychological defects like murders, suicides, natural deaths, shootings. These do not have to be disclosed to a buyer. So as a realtor, you have to follow lawful instructions. So if you have a buyer client and you know there is a murder, you would have to disclose it. But for everyone else, you would have to ask the seller, what do I say if someone asks me if there was a murder? And if the seller says, tell them the truth, you tell them the truth. If the seller says lie, then cancel the listing because you can't lie. But it's very important that you get instructions from your seller and you follow those instructions and do not do anything against the law or unethical. Somebody says, if you waive the home inspection, can you go back to the seller if you find problems out after closing? In my experience, the answer is no. Unless the defect you find would be something that, again, would never have been able to be discovered even if you had a home inspection, the seller will not be responsible. And this is why it is so important to try to get these inspections done. If you're nervous about this, stigmas, I always say to Google the property address on the internet. Now, I used to say talk to the neighbors, but that's not going to be so easy now when you're practicing social distance. Not sure you can ring the bell and talk to the neighbor from the street 30 feet away. I'm not sure they're going to be too happy about that. But also, I've given you a clause to use in this case, and this is my clause to use, where the seller is stating right in the agreement that there's no murder, suicide, illegal grow-up, etc. And if there was, and the seller knew about it, then the buyer could sue the seller after closing. So as you can see, these are not normal times. They're really not normal times. But what we're trying to do is on the one hand, teach you the law that people cannot cancel deals because of this. They've got to work together. and give you some clauses that you can use that will better make the deal able to close. And so it'll help lawyers get the deal done, and it'll minimize, social contact and still let the deals close in a timely manner. And so I think this brings us to the end of the webinar. And what I may do now is just stop the share. And this way, I think you can still see me, but it'll be easier for me to answer questions that you have. So if anybody wants to just send me a text if you found the webinar was good or informative, I would appreciate the feedback as well if you want to chat me a note. But if anybody else has a question, this is a great time to do that. So I'm seeing some great comments. Thank you very much. But if there's any questions, I'm going to stay on for a couple of minutes. If there's not a question right now, I want you to remember you can always email me to mark@realestatelawyers.ca. You can call me toll free, 1-888-876-5529 with any question as well. Someone asked for the slides. As I said, this has been recorded, so I'm going to get this recording into Danielle's hands, and she's going to be able to send it out to you, so you'll have the ability to have all the slides as well. If you want to get some particular slides, send me an email, and I'm happy to send them to you as well. So I'm just looking. I don't see any other questions right now. So let's see. On a commercial leasing deal, would I recommend any clauses? Commercial leasing is a different game. And I'm very troubled by what's going on in the market because you see, with residential, you can't evict a tenant without going to the landlord and tenant board, and they're closed down. But in commercial, under most leases which govern, all you have to do if the rent is not paid is you could go in with a bailiff and lock the tenant out. And I'm very troubled by this because in normal times, if a landlord tried this, the tenant could go to court to try to overturn the eviction. Well, the courts are closed. And so I think landlords are going to have to think twice. So it's very hard for me to just suggest clauses for commercial leases because it's not government mandated. Every commercial lease is different depending on the landlord, depending on the tenant. So I'll see. I'm not sure if Danielle, if she's not able to send the slides out separately. Again, oh, I see that there may be a link for things, but again, if you want some slides, just send me an email and I'm happy to send them as well. Again, mark@realestatelawyers.ca. So with that, I want to thank everybody for joining, and I wish you all to be safe and healthy and just continue to do business in a safe way. Thank you.